Ah, there we go. Um, okay. Could I please ask everybody to do me a favor? If my show notes show on top of it, could you please let me know and interrupt me? Because I can't quite tell. I had a bug in Zoom a few weeks ago where it would show my show notes on top of my talk. But if not, I take it from the silence, we're good to go.
I see some window with time ticking in the left top corner.
That's the one. That's the one. Thank you. Thank you. That means that my show notes are indeed showing on top of my window. And I don't know why that happens in Zoom only. So I will try and
wait. Now I see just the presentation with subtitles at the bottom.
Fantastic. Thank you for confirming. So yes, thank you all for having me today. This is my first time here, and I'm so excited. I'm very grateful for the invite. And yeah, let's talk a little bit about mentorship. This is something that is applicable to lots of other languages and frameworks, but the examples that I will bring in today will mostly come from Ruby and Rails, as I am, for a lot of intents and purposes, a Rails developer as well. So let's talk about mentorship. Yes, and I think the best way to do that is to tell you a little bit about my story and what my relationship, sorry, I got some windows floating in here, what my relationship with mentorship is. And in order to do that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me in case you don't know who I am. Yeah, my name's Ramon. Hi. My pronouns are he, him. I'm living in Austria, and I'm head of open source at codebase. I've been developing software mostly as a freelancer for over a decade now, but lately have started working in developer relations, which means I'm still doing lots of software development, but a lot more in tapping into and the enablement of software developers around the world. I've also lately started doing more coding instruction, which has been a lot of fun. I'm actually in the process of creating my first ever course in TypeScript, which will be in Spanish, and I'm launching that next year. And I'm very, very excited about that. Yeah, and I just care a whole lot about tech communities and mentoring and that sort of thing. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. The objective of this talk is to get you sort of excited about not just about mentorship itself. If you're interested in mentorship, even if you're perhaps at a starting point in your career, I think mentorship can apply at lots of different levels. And even if you've been out of it for the game, maybe there's a couple of things that I've picked up here through the years that might be helpful for you. So back to me. I love talking about me. So I'm going to set the stage. Many, many years ago, my girlfriend and I were moving in together, and I was looking for my first ever job. And I was in university, and I wasn't feeling so good about my skills, and I actually had very little experience. And so I was looking on the newspaper, on the newspaper. I'm not that old. I was looking on the want ads online for for software development jobs in general, but actually more so towards babysitting and that sort of thing. So not so much software development. But then my wife, my girlfriend at the time, took a look at one of the want ads and said, hey, look, somebody's looking for a macOS developer. Didn't you just buy your first ever MacBook? And I thought, well, I did. You know what? I'm going to give it a try. So I sent off an email. I was feeling a little bit like confident, but not really. And the person who was looking for this macOS developer actually took the offer upon me and decided to meet me. So being in Vienna, of course, we met at the Mozart Cafe, because where else are we going to meet? And I'll never forget, this was like 10 or 11 years ago. This person sat me down, his name's Philip, and he said to me, Ramon, listen, I've taken a look at your CV and I'm impressed with what you've done so far, but I got to ask you a question. Why did you apply for this job? You don't actually have any relevant experience. And I said to him, Philip, I know I'm starting out. I feel like I can learn quickly. I was feeling oddly confident that day. And I told him, I'm feeling confident. Why not? And I think I can learn quickly. And he said, well, I'll tell you what. I like talking to you. You seem like a nice person. I cannot let you start developing software for me yet. But I'll tell you what, I'm looking for somebody to do some email support for me. And while you're doing that, here's a book. And he gave me a recommendation for a book, just to give you an idea of how long ago this was. This is Cocoa Programming for Mac OS X. So before it was called Mac OS, the third edition written by Alan Hilligas. This is a very, very old book, but a very helpful book, because it kind of gave me sort of my first introduction to some of the more core tenets of programming. And the programming languages, by the way, in case you're curious, was Objective-C. Good times. Anyway, and this guy, Philip, he started taking me under his wing and sort of teaching me, after a few months of reading the book and doing the email support, he let me start doing some updates to the apps. And through that, he kind of introduced me to Ruby. Turns out a lot of the tool chains for automating our build of these macOS apps was written in Ruby, and through that introduced me to Rails. And a few months in, he sent me an email, and I'll never forget this email because the title of the email, the subject of the email was, "I'm highly pleased with your work." And this email meant so much to me. It kind of changed everything for me, if I'm honest with you. And through that, I realized that all these years, because we're still working together to this day, Philip still is and was my mentor. So that's my background with mentorship. Now I'm going to do that part of the presentation where I bring out an internet definition of what mentorship is. So we're going to read this together. So mentorship is a relationship between two people where the individual with more experience, knowledge, and connections is able to pass along what they've learned to a more junior individual within a certain field. And this is a great definition because what I like about it is that there's no mention of seniority here. There's no mention of like how long that experience has to have, but we'll get to that in a bit. Here's a couple of things I want to cover first. I think mentorship, we kind of give it a bit of a reputation of having just one-on-one mentor and mentee relationship. But I want to argue that mentorship is kind of happening everywhere as we speak. For example, here's a picture from the PyLadies, what was it called? Flask, that's it. The Flask workshop. And this is a picture from 2014. It's quite an old picture. And what's going on here is you've got folks learning how to code in Python and Flask. We used to have these in Ruby and Rails as well. I think that I've been to the Rails Girls workshop in Prague. I love that workshop. That was a great time. Yeah. And what I love about these workshops is you've got a couple of mentors there who are just hanging out and teaching people the ropes, getting them to install Ruby. A lot of them show up with Windows machines. So of course that means there's, at least there was all those years ago, a very difficult, before Windows subsystem for Linux existed, a very intricate song and dance of getting to install Ruby and Rails on Windows and getting it to work. I remember specifically SQLite being quite a problem on Windows, at least back in the day. But anyway, there was that relationship that, again, was not just one-on-one, but distributed around lots of folks, even between mentors. Mentorship can also take place online. I'm sure we've all had experiences like this before. This is a screenshot from a pull request that I made on GitHub to a project written in Rails for Rails Girls Summer of Code. Not sure if you're familiar with that. That was a really cool crowd-funded program to get underrepresented folks into open source development. Not just Rails, but Rails was a big part of it. Sadly, this program shut down. Some of my favorite work that I've ever done was helping to organize this. Anyway, in this pull request, I was being given some feedback. Klappradler here, my good friend Max, was saying, I've added some small comments here and there and giving me some opportunity to giving me some feedback so that we can make this code better, but also an opportunity for me to learn and hone my skills as a software developer. Now, mentorship can happen offline, online, but not just between adults, also between adults and children. I think I mentioned in passing in one of the breakout rooms, but my wife and I used to teach children to code. I should preface, these pictures are all shared with permission. Yeah, so here's a picture from a long time ago as well, from an after-school activity we used to run where we would teach children to code. We would actually do this in Ruby as well. We would use a gem called Gosu. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of it. Gosu. Gosu was super cool for making games back in the day, and I loved it. And so we would do that. We would teach them the core concepts of programming. With games, it was always fun because it was sort of chaotic, but also constrained within Ruby. We would also use Sonic Pi, which is a music programming environment, which also allows you to write Ruby to make music. But again, it doesn't also happen between one team at a time. It also happens in a distributed fashion around the whole world. So what you see here, for example, is an example of mentorship happening throughout 3 different groups. This is through the Rails Girls Summer of Code, which I mentioned earlier. We got folks, we're going to go clockwise. We got folks in India, we got folks in Austria, we've got folks in Colombia. It was a wonderful experience, and being able to do that around the world was incredibly gratifying. Finally, another example of mentorship in tech doesn't necessarily have to revolve around programming. It can also revolve around speaking. The photo you see here is from 2019 or 2020. I've lost track of time. This last couple of years has been a whirlwind, hasn't it? Anyway, this picture is from an event called the Global Diversity CFP Day, which again is a worldwide event, which takes in the form of a workshop to motivate underrepresented folks to start speaking, doing public speaking at conferences and submitting CFPs. If you're not familiar with CFPs, it's short for call for papers or call for proposals, where folks can, write up a proposal for a talk at a conference. So that's some examples of different shapes that mentorship can take. But I also want to answer the question, why in the first place be a mentor? And I'm going to be quoting from a book that my friend Gelius wrote. This is a fantastic resource called the Mentorship Guidebook. And what it is we're going to answer this in 3 ways. First off, might be a little bit obvious, it helps others. So you can, by mentoring somebody, you can help them with their career, with their education, help them combat imposter syndrome, more on that later, and help them with their projects in general. But it also helps you as a mentor. You learn a little bit more about yourself. It helps you articulate ideas. It helps you expand your worldview. It helps you make more friends, more allies, more support. And it's really gratifying, and it feels good to give back. It helps you find knowledge gaps in your thinking. And most importantly, learn something new, not just about tech, but about yourself. But there's a third group of people that I think are affected by us doing mentoring, which is all of us as a community. We encourage ourselves to be collaborative, to be inclusive, to thrive, to grow, to teach, to learn. I think it's so important. So before I get into some tools and tips that I've picked up over the years, I just want to make a quick distinction between mentoring and teaching. Now, of course, this is opinion-based, and I'm very, very eager to hear your disagreements on this, but here's how I see a distinction between mentoring and teaching. I like to think of teaching going one way. You got a teacher, you got a student. Knowledge goes from A to B. Whereas with mentoring, yes, you do have a preset knowledge flow of mentor to mentee, but by asking questions and having open conversations, I'd like to think that with mentoring, knowledge flows both ways. So having said all that, let's look at some ways that we can be good mentors. And I'm going to start at the very beginning of a mentor-mentee relationship. And that is to open by asking a very open question. Open with asking, what are your goals to your mentee? Why do you need mentorship? Why is it important for you to get this mentorship from me? Why am I the right person for you to be your mentor? And not just to do that at the beginning, but I think especially as time passes and you help this person grow in their career, it might come that from every moment, every now and then, you might need to check in with your mentee and say, hey, is this still your goal? Are we still going in the right direction? Maybe you've realized something. Maybe you don't want to be a project manager. Maybe you want to be a team lead. Maybe you want to go into developer relations. Who knows? Yeah. And by doing so, having this sort of formalized habit of having regular goal check-ins, I think it's important to also encourage your mentee to develop some of those good habits, because when it comes to a mentor-mentee relationship, maybe it'll last just an hour. I usually do some 1 hour long career discussions with folks, but I feel like those extend beyond just that one session or a couple sessions or years, because mentorship is not just long-term. Every piece of advice that we give somebody, it propagates from that one person to the next. In a sense, I don't want to sound too arrogant when I say this, but in a sense, we're not just mentoring our mentee, but in a way, if our mentee goes on to become a mentor, then we're kind of, in a sense, also passing knowledge to that mentor's mentee, grand mentee. You know what I mean? I think it's important to bear that in mind. It carries a lot of responsibility. And one of the most important habits I try to instill in somebody from day one is the concept of empathy. Because one of the best things we can do as a mentor is to try to put ourselves in the shoes of our mentee and say, have I been in that situation before? How would I deal with something like, I don't know, React.js being the first thing that you learn coming into your first developer position. What does Rails look like in 2021 compared to Rails 4, which is when I started? Side note, I recently tried upgrading a Rails 4 project to today, and I'm not the same person. Anyway, and by having this empathic communication, we also instill good, honest, effective communication, because one of the most important tools that we have as software developers is one of communication. I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time doing freelancing, and that's so important for me to be able to communicate with my clients effectively, explain to them, for example, why it's taking me 3 months to upgrade a Rails 4 project to 6, and prepare for 7 potentially. Being able to explain in terms, for example, between myself and another colleague, hey, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm trying to do. Pair programming, same thing. It's all about communication. It's really important to have that and instill that from day one. Another thing that I like to think that's related to communication is about questions. We ask a lot of questions, we answer a lot of questions, but the best questions are those that are specific, focused, and narrow. And at the same time, when we're dealing with a mentee and doing what are called guided questions, we'll get on those later, we need to make them challenging as well. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been in a situation where you've met somebody who's interested in programming and they've asked you a question, something like this: which programming language should I learn if I want to work as a web developer and make a lot of money? And you sort of think of that, and I don't know about you, but I've always found yes, Ruby, but if we were thinking specifically here, we would probably think, and I bet we've all thought of this answer, well, it depends. Do you want to do front end? Do you want to do back end? That sort of thing. So, and any programming language that we learn now probably will not carry over 100% into the next 5 years. Look at the way Ruby has changed in the last 25 years. It's been 25, I think it's 26 now, or 27. Anyway, so I like to think, okay, how can we make this question narrower? So for example, I would say, which programming language should I learn first if I want to work as a web developer? Which already constrains it a little bit. But even so, we can take this a step further, because this is my context. Which programming language should I learn first? But we don't know that person that well yet. What if we constrain this question even more to ask, what's a good programming language to learn first? And then we can explore that context and say, okay, for example, maybe for you, because you're going into data science, maybe something like Python would be better for you. Just throwing out examples. And again, by having these good habits and by showing them what our perspectives are, another thing that I like to do is have a good habit of exposing instead of imposing. One thing that I've learned in the last 10 years is that as software developers, myself included, we form our opinions and we stick to them. We get our opinions and we're like, no. This is why this should be the way. This is what I like, and this is the way it is. And I found myself tempted to think that way too. And we have lots of opinions, but I think it's important that when we're bringing somebody into software development or into our realm of programming, our niche of software development, I think it's important to bear in mind that our idea, the things that work for us, are probably not going to work for everybody else. So for example, when it comes to something like an editor, again, I was talking about coding editors, that is. I was talking about Sonic Pi and how at some shows people would do this magic Emacs stuff, and it was super cool, but I'd never done Emacs in my life. So I was like, nope, I'm more of a Vim person myself. But lately it turns out more and more that VS Code is turning into the de facto way to do programming nowadays. Exposing, hey, I like Vim, but here's VS Code, for example, is pretty important. Same goes for programming languages. As I said before, I think we're all going to be pretty eager to encourage Ruby as a programming language, but different tools for different contexts. Maybe in this context, for example, we'd want to use JavaScript or Elixir or Rust. Same goes for coding styles. This applies a little less to Ruby because we've got great linting in it, but even so, how do we do line breaking? How do we do tabbing inside line breaks? And for example, nested hashes, for example, when it comes to tech, we were just talking about Zoom, right? I'm presenting to you right now from a Windows machine, but you might prefer Mac OS, you might prefer Linux. I miss working in Linux. Anyway, same goes for Git history styles. Like I'm sure a lot of us have different ways of doing our Git histories, different ways of preferring them. Some might like small commit often. Some people might prefer big conventional commits. Some might prefer something else. Some people prefer merging. Some people prefer rebasing. Exposing our mentee to the way things are done and why we personally prefer this over the other is really important to carry that forward. And again, by doing so, we get to be supportive for our mentee. So I'm going to go back to what I was talking about before, and that's about imposter syndrome. In case you're not familiar with the term, imposter syndrome is a phenomenon that happens to a lot of folks where they get to a position where that they've been excited about, but suddenly feel like they kind of cheated their way in, or like they don't belong, that they've kind of lied their way into the position that they're in. That, no, I don't know. I'm not a programmer. I don't know how to, make a migration in Active Record. For example, or I don't know how to create a table view in SQL, something like this. And we feel like, and over time, for some of us, it goes away. For some of us, we develop tools to be able to handle it. That's where I would say I am. And you can offer these to when you see your mentee having that imposter syndrome and you tell them, hey, listen, this is what worked for me. These are the perspectives from my experience, how I dealt with, for example, the rise of Elixir compared to Ruby. There was a period, I want to say in 2017 moving forward, where every conference I would go to would have the talk, is Ruby dead? Or some kind of variant of that. And they came quite often. And I would think like, oh my gosh, am I out of a job? Excuse me. Yeah. Giving our mentee the perspective of how we handled that in our own context is really helpful. And when it comes to offering our perspective, I think the same goes for feedback. Hopefully this hasn't happened to all of us, but I'm sure there are examples among us of folks that we've gotten a piece of feedback that is not constructive, but destructive and just the worst review on GitHub we've ever seen. And I've often found myself, when I get those pieces of feedback from negative teammates, and I ask myself, am I in the right place? That imposter syndrome comes screaming back. And I find myself thinking, how do I prevent this in the future? And I think there is a way. People have different ways of preferring feedback, and having that open communication and asking your mentee how they prefer to get that feedback is super important. One thing that I would recommend that really works well for me when giving feedback is asking guided questions. So if you're not familiar with them, guided questions are an open kind of question that lead into a discussion that involves a lot of critical thinking. So I'm going to show you one of the two only slides that I have with code in this presentation. So let's look at some Rails ERB, or embedded Ruby if you're more of the Haml sort. So I got this pull request from a colleague of mine that I was mentoring, and this was a translation for getting the week number and passing in that number from a range, getting the first date out of a range and getting its week number and displaying that week space number of week. Now, a lot of you will look at us and think, oh, there's a couple of code smells in here. And this is what I thought as well. For example, whenever I see code concatenation like this with an empty string in it, with a space in it, I'm thinking, no, we could do some string interpolation here. But taking it further, I thought, okay, how am I going to communicate this to my mentee? So I actually asked them a question. I asked them, what happens if we have a spoken language that we're translating to here, where the week number is in the middle of a sentence? Now, of all the times I've given this talk, I have yet to think of an example of one, but that's not the point. If you think of one, please let me know in the chat. I'd love to hear an example. But we opened up that discussion, and then my mentee realized, oh, yeah, this isn't going to work. So how do I fix it? And so I kind of led me and my mentee, we kind of went down a journey of discovery, looking at the docs for internationalization, and and we found a way to do it. It turns out, in case you're curious, second slide with code, that it's possible to have a translation call where we pass in that date, now that week number, date is a misnomer there, as a parameter into that translation. And then in the locale file, we can put it wherever in the string we like. So with that, we were able to find a way for it to work. And I didn't have to feed my mentee the answer. And the feedback was constructed, and it made my mentee feel empowered. So let's talk about maximizing help and minimizing harm. There's a great blog post that I recommend from Will Larson called Mentoring from Privilege. And I think it's super important when it comes into mentoring to invest some time into recognizing my own privilege and how that how that plays into having a mentor-mentee relationship. There are going to be places where I will be asked for advice in which I don't have the expertise or the knowledge to be able to do that. And it's very tempting to just sort of give a vague answer that says like, well, this is what I would do because this is what works for me. But again, understanding that difference of context and background of a person is really important. So if you offer, because one thing you can do as a mentor is leverage that network and be able to say, well, I know a person who's had a similar situation to yours, and being able to show that example as a person from this background is really important to show what it is that a healthy tech community does. So it's important, with permission, of course, to also incorporate counterpoint stories from peers and coworkers with different degrees of this privilege that have had these different experiences. And a lot of this involves what I want to go into next, which is about being attentive. Listening is so important when it comes to being a good mentor. Whenever I mentor somebody, I like to think of myself as an on-the-shelf rubber ducky. If you're not familiar with it, rubber ducky programming is a concept where you have a rubber ducky on your shelf that you explain your programming problem that you're stuck to, and by explaining it out loud, you kind of find yourself unlocking certain parts of your brain that help you get to that knowledge area that you're looking for. Now, I don't have a rubber ducky myself. I have this thing. I want to show it to you. I got this in Korea. It's like half dog, half penguin. I call him the penguin dogo. Yeah, that's what I use. Anyway, and I think it's really important to do this from the perspective of a mentee. Let's say I'm presented and my mentee's telling me about an idea they're having. It's super tempting, especially if I think that my mentee is wrong, to just interrupt them and say, no, let's do it this way. But I think it's super important to just let the mentee speak out everything they want to say. Even if you 100% disagree or think they're wrong, let them voice it out, because one of a couple of things will happen. One, the mentee, while explaining to you, might realize that they're wrong. Or more, and this could happen, that while you listen to your mentee, you might realize that you're wrong and that the mentee was right all along. It's really important to listen and have that patience, because as a mentor and a mentee, as I said earlier, what we're doing is learning together. And as I mentioned when I was talking about minimizing harm, it's really important to avoid giving advice on topics that I'm not familiar with. Again, it can be really tempting to try and come up with like a vague answer to something. But I found that one of the most empowering things I can do for a mentee is demystify the fact that as a senior developer, I have all the answers. And to just, there's a phrase I learned that I really want to touch base on today, which is, you know what? I don't know. Let's find out. So I'll tell you a little story about that. Many years ago, when I was teaching kids to code games, we would do this thing where we would eventually get to making graphical games. So what you see here is a terrible drawing that I made showcasing a game window and a character drawn on screen. And so the kids would get super excited, and I would show them, hey, this is how you draw your character on the screen. It's got an X coordinate along the horizontal axis and a Y coordinate along the Y axis. And if both of these values change, then the character will look like it's moving around the screen. And when both of these are 0, the origin, the character will be drawn at the top left. And I'll never forget this. One of the kids asks us, like, hold on a second. In math class, I learned, the kid said, that the graphs, the origin is at the bottom left. Why are computer programmers doing this so complicated and different? And it was short on time. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, I just want to teach this and get it over with. But then I thought, okay, let's try this. You know what? I don't know. Let's find out. And so we sat down and we Googled it, and I'm going to share the answer with you today because it's fascinating. It turns out because of the way that old screens would work. So back in the day, and I can say this because I'm old enough to say this, back in my day, computer screens were big and chunky, and they were made with they were displayed with what were called cathode ray tubes, and they would render their images extremely quickly from top to bottom in a row. Each pixel would go left to right. So the first pixel that would get rendered was at the top left. I think I'm pointing correctly. At the top left of the screen, which is amazing. And I'm going to show you this in action because I got a GIF. Yeah, it's an animated GIF, so it might be a little flashy, just letting you all know. So somebody took a 10,000 frames per second camera and filmed a TV playing the game Super Mario Brothers in slow motion. And look at this. It's rendering slowly, line by line, pixel by pixel, left to right. I think this is beautiful and horrifying at the same time. I think it's amazing. There's a link there if you want to check it out. I'll put my slides are online. I'll give you all the link in a sec. But yeah, going on these journeys of discovery with your mentee is super handy as well. And I think it's important to just take the time and just be like, hey, you know what? I don't know how to exit Vim. Let's go on this journey together, and just type into our favorite search engine, how to exit Vim, for example. One of my favorite questions I've ever been asked at one of these mentoring situations was at a Rails Girls workshop, where somebody asked me, hey, Ramon, we've been doing HTML for a while. Why is it called a div? And you know what? I never wondered to ask why it's called a div. In case you're interested, it's because it's short for divider. Who would have thought? It's again, and it's kind of this invitation to have these guided questions, which I touched upon before, guiding mentees to their answers. And I think this is such a handy tool because it also invites us, which is my next point, to show our thinking process out loud. One thing I've started doing lately is having live streams where I do some coding and I do some exercises on my own, and folks join in and they give me advice. It's kind of like an ensemble programming kind of environment. And what I love to do is just talk out loud, show my thinking process, show what works for me. Because what I think, and I said this before as well, there's this sort of myth I find with a lot of junior programmers that as seniors, we have all the answers. And one thing I aim to do, especially when it comes to something as magic as Rails, is to try and demystify that and take that magic and show that at the end of the day, this is all code. This is all brilliantly thought out pieces of code. And those abstractions, where appropriate, can totally be dived into. And every now and then, like even at workshops and stuff, I love to take a moment and just be like, hey, let's take a deep dive now. And I'll take out a piece of paper and I'll do a terrible drawing. Again, I'm sorry, I'm really not good at drawing. And I'll see, like, this is the client, this is the server, and this is how an HTTP request works. And just take the time, give them some resources. Some of my favorite resources, for example, include, if we're learning regular expressions, I love regex crossword. In case anybody's familiar with this is super fun because it lets you play games while learning regular expressions. For CSS selectors, I totally recommend the game CSS Diner, which again is a really nice way to learn how to call elements off of a DOM with with dots and hashtags and all the other kinds of selectors. Again, more front end, if we're also thinking like how to learn Flexbox, I totally recommend Flexbox Froggy. It's one of my favorite games and it's super fun. And you're sort of showing your knowledge, how you got your knowledge. Because when it comes to mentorship, I think it's really important to bear in mind that knowledge and experience really are relative. I might be an expert in one thing, but there might be another thing that I won't know anything about. I'm going to tell a short story that actually comes from my sister, who is now a cloud engineer and team lead. And when she started out, she did a Rails Girls workshop just outside of Vienna in St. Pölten. And she did this workshop. She had a wonderful time. She learned to make Rails apps, then went home, and the organizer emailed her and said, hey, we're going to have one in Linz now, which is about an hour outside of Vienna. Do you want to come and be a mentor? And she said, well, hold on. I just did my first ever workshop. I'm not ready. But the mentor said something that I found really important and I'll never forget, which is that concept that having that experience closer to that newcomer is actually super valuable because for example, the pain of trying to install Rails on Windows back in 2017-16. I don't know how it is now. I haven't done it in a while. I use WSL for that. Anyway, yeah. And not only is that perspective important, and it goes the other way as well, huh? Mentoring at higher seniority levels is also super important. For example, I might be a senior developer who's interested in going into project management or going into developer relations or going into, I don't know, if I'm a senior web developer, I might be interested in going into graphics programming. So I might totally be able to get the mentorship from somebody who probably hasn't been in the industry around that long, but knows a lot about, say, I wanted to say GraphQL, but that's not what I meant. GL, WebGL. Yeah, exactly. OpenGL, that's it. Yeah, and might be able to teach me the concepts of graphics programming from there. Now, one of the last things I want to touch upon when it comes to mentorship, and I think this is super important to say this, I say this and it's advice that I should take as well, is that it's important to take care of myself and know my own limits. I found that if I take on too many mentees at one time, I will start getting tired or stressed or overextended, and the quality of my mentorship will suffer. So I think it's super important that if you're interested in mentoring, do please take care of yourself. It's important that for you as a mentor to show good habits. And one of those is taking care of yourself. So I've been talking for a while now. So I'm going to answer one last question before I go, which is, okay, you've been listening to me for a while and you're thinking, hey, this sounds really cool. Where can I go to mentor folks? So I'm going to give you some pieces of advice, if I may. So first off, see in your local area. This is, of course, easier back when we could meet in person more easily. But here in Vienna, for example, you'll find a couple of these kinds of workshops like Coder Dojo, Rails Girls Workshops, Rails Bridge, Rust Bridge. Those are more American kinds of things. Of course, here in Prague, we had the, I say here, but over in Prague, we had the Rails Girls workshop. I want to say 2019. That was such a wonderful time. I miss it. Another thing that you can do online that I highly recommend is hosting open advice one-on-ones. For example, this is an idea that my friend Jess came up with, where she would just put out a tweet on Twitter and just say, hey, I'm available, send me a DM and we'll make an appointment and just talk about your career. I think it's super important to be able to do that. And I'm going to link to a set of resources that she wrote up on that if you're interested in trying something like that out. Another thing I can recommend doing if you've got an open source project and you've got the time to be able to do that is to tag your open source issues and say, hey, I would be available to mentor, for example, for this issue or that issue. I think this would be a great first issue for somebody starting out. Maybe you're not doing open source, but you're pretty, heads down working at your workplace. I think it's important to ask around and say, hey, maybe your workplace has an internal program for doing mentorship. And if not, hey, maybe suggest starting one, heading that up. I think that carries a lot of weight and helps a workplace thrive. Because a workplace could, would, and should, in my opinion, want to invest in the growth of their engineers. So you can totally do that. Another thing you can do if you've got the time, I've been doing this online myself, is to start a community of practice. This is a term that I learned from my buddy Joe. And he recommends, the reason I love this name, because what it is what it says. It's a meetup where every now and then everybody just gets together and co-works. It can be on anything. It can be any programming language. It can be any kind of context. People can have their headphones on. They can talk together. And there's sort of like that co-working vibe that I think is really fun. And another last thing you can do is learn in public. This is a term that's come out quite recently. And I really like it because what you're doing is taking all your learning and just sharing it with the world, no matter how simple it might seem. What a lot of folks are doing actually is starting to grow what's called a digital garden. And I love this because it's kind of like a blog, but it's a little bit more. Is the word leafy? I want to say like leaf-like it grows in different directions. And you can sort of consolidate all this knowledge and just share it with the world as a sort of like an open wiki of knowledge. And this is super fun to do. If you're interested in that, I totally recommend the book Working in Public by Nadia Egbal. Super, super fun resource and a super joyous way to be able to share that knowledge. So yeah, that's kind of the long and short of what I've been here to talk to you about today with mentorship. And I just want to extend that definition that I shared at the beginning just a touch, because I think when it comes to mentorship, you're not just sharing knowledge, but I like to think that you're also sharing the joy of sharing knowledge and showing why that's so important to you. So as promised, here's a whole bunch of resources that I did in researching what's going on today. Highly recommend the book, Building Successful Online Communities. It's well researched and very, very helpful. So yeah, but I always say this to everybody, if you're interested in having some one-on-ones about going somewhere in your tech career, please get in touch. That's my Twitter handle up there, Hola Soy Milk. And yeah, thanks for listening. And of course, are there any questions? Oh, sorry, I just realized my head.
It took me a while to plug in my earphones again, but thank you for the talk. It was brilliant. To be fair, it's awesome how translatable the things are even to non-technical fields. The mentorship works pretty much the same way in everything. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I would like to add that it's brilliant to see somebody so honest and not pretending. You can see that you are really excited. This is something that really you enjoy, and that's brilliant. And I think, as you said, spreading the joy and not only the experience. That's exactly what you do. So thank you for sharing this with us. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm just looking at the chat. I'm so sorry if the subtitles were distracting. I always put them up just in case somebody would prefer to follow them, because sometimes I get a little nervous and I talk quickly, and I try to be able to be inclusive to folks who are hard of hearing, for example. I'm glad. I'm glad that notepad worked.
So Eva, did we have any questions we should answer?
Not during the talk, actually. Does anyone have a question that you would like to ask now? Can unmute yourself.
That's a great book.
Okay, so I will bite again. So you mentioned the internal company program that everyone should have, in your opinion. Like, do you mean like in some official capacity? Because in my experience, for everyone not junior, it's job description anyway. So I'm just curious if you could expand a bit on this topic.
Oh yeah. So when you say when you say that for a junior it's part of the job description, do you mean that I
meant for anyone who's not junior, it's part of job description to help others anyway. That is I meant to say that.
Yeah, gotcha. No, thank you for clarifying. So yeah, no, I've seen myself in some situations. Again, I've only actually ever entered my first employed status this year. So your mileage may vary, but I have found myself within my peers in the community seeing sometimes that they would have had to ask for official mentorship programs inside a company. And to clarify, that is a situation where you are assigned a mentor who guides you through an onboarding process and kind of guides you through the next steps of your career, helps guide you and mentor you through the next steps of your career. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you. That basically describes what we call buddy system. So.
Oh, I like that. Buddy system. I like that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
Okay, I want to ask if you have a mentee that just solved some problem and it's working, it's great, but you still feel the needs that okay, it's working, but there is more elegant solution for something, or there is something better or more profound solution to the same problem. So, and you don't want to insult him, or we don't want to just shake his joy for solving the problem. You want just to point out that okay, it's good, but it can be better by this way. So, what is your approach?
That's a great question. So if I understood correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong. So this would be a situation where if I found that I would get a solution from my mentee that does indeed work, but maybe I've got an idea of how to perhaps maybe make it more efficient, or perhaps a nicer, let's say more beautiful Ruby solution to that. How can I approach suggesting this? And I think, is that correct? Yeah, cool. I think there's a couple of ways that I feel like what we can do. I mean, this is something where a code review works wonderfully, because I think asking these guided questions is what really leads us. Maybe there's an edge case that my colleague would have missed, or perhaps there's a way that we could have done this. For example, let's use a pretty straightforward approach. Maybe we use a for loop where we as Rubyists know that using an each or a map might be nicer, right? How could we approach going through that? I think just introducing somebody and say like, hey, this works great. Like you said, actually, I think your approach is really good, where you say like, hey, thank you for this. this works really well. Let me show you some other ways that you can do this that might be nicer. And it doesn't perhaps have to go in the code right away. Maybe there's a nice active record shortcut that you can show them that says like, hey, this is a way of doing like, I don't know, mixing lots of active relations together nicely, for example, and just introducing them to this way by doing either guided questions or, if the situation permits it, going into that deep dive that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, thanks. I think at the very end, you will find out that sometimes there are 2 or 3 solutions that are equally same, or so. Then it's just the question of reference.
Absolutely.
If you prefer this and he or she is preferring something else.
I think if I were to go back to the points I was making earlier, I think this would kind of fall into the category of exposing versus imposing. You can expose someone to why you like this way better, why you prefer to have, say, chained together active record queries, for example.
Okay, thanks.
Sure thing. Just have another sip of water while somebody asks a question, or I guess we can go to the next talk.
Okay.
Well,